One feature we haven't gotten to yet, and one that would really spruce up our app, is the ability to take a profile picture. And the way that we want to do that is we want to store it locally, but we want to initialize a camera module in order for us to be able to take pictures of ourselves while we record, in this case. And so by doing that, we'll be able to store the image of the user and know subsequently who they are, where they are. And we'll do it with the front-facing camera in order to have the ability to store that profile picture against the user account and thus load it when they log in. And that ability will allow us to have a more personalized experience for the user. So knowing that, let's get started on how to do this. Now that we know how we want our camera feature to look, what we need to do is we need to set in place the building blocks in order for us to be able to store pictures on our phone. Now, in order for us to do that, what we saw here is in the settings screen, when we tapped on our avatar, what we would do is pull up a settings camera screen. So we would flow from this screen over to another screen, which means navigation is one of our main concerns here. So we're going to have to add some navigation. If we go over into our infrastructure folder, into the navigation folder, we know that we have our settings navigator over here, and our settings navigator has different stack screens. So one screen that we could add over here then is the camera screen, and we'll give it a camera screen component, which will come from the settings feature. So over here, feature screens settings, what we'll do is we'll add a camera screen, and then we'll say in the feature settings screens, we'll have a camera.screen. And then what we need to do is build out that screen in the features folder, settings, screens. Now we'll add a new file, camera.screen.js. And now that we have that, what we can basically do is start building out our camera screen. So we'll do export const camera screen is equal to null for now, right? As equal to a function that returns null. So we're not going to render out anything right off the bat. We'll import React from React just to make sure. And now what we need to do is take in this camera screen in some way. So if we go over to the settings screen, we know over here that on the avatar container, we have our avatar icon. And when we click this avatar icon is when we want to pull up the screen. So what we can do here is, well, we can pull in a styled.touchable opacity, or we could just import touchable opacity from React Native. So let's do that. Import touchable opacity from React Native. And this again enables us with a slight fade to do a touchable around any given element. So we'll do a touchable opacity around the avatar container. And what we'll have that do is over here we have navigation. So what we'll do is on press, we'll make it go to, so navigation dot, and let's go see how we use navigation, navigation.navigate. And we'll navigate to camera. Now, if we do this, what's going to happen over here if we reload is when we press this, we'll go over to the camera screen, but it won't really give us anything to see because we're rendering null. So if we go over to settings and we click it, now we're seeing the camera screen. So we've set up our scenery for our camera module, but now how are we going to implement the camera module? Like Mo, what options do we have now that we've set up everything we need to set up in order to implement the camera? Well, let's take a look at that. As with everything we do, when we're trying to implement a new feature, we can reach to the Expo documentation to give us a sense of how we can accomplish this. So if we press the search function and we said camera, what we can see here is that they have an entire document specified for how to use the camera. And so they have a package called Expo Camera, which provides a React component that renders a preview for the device front and back camera. It also takes in zoom, autofocus, white balance, all that good stuff, so we can adjust parameters if we see it fit. With the use of the camera, we can also take photos and record videos. And so it works on the Android device, the iOS device, but it will not work on the emulators because the emulators, these things that we use over here to render out on the computer, our app, they do not have a camera module. So it will not work on the emulators. You will need to use your device in order to test this. Okay, so how do we go about this? Well, the installation is pretty straightforward. It's what we've always done. Expo install Expo camera. Okay, so if we copy this and we go over here and we open up our terminal and we open up a separate terminal, what we can do is we can run our Expo install command, and this will allow us to install the Expo camera dependencies that we need in order to get Expo camera running. Now, in managed apps, the camera requires permissions.camera. Video recording requires permissions.audio recording. This means that we're going to have to request the user for permissions the first time that they open up the camera module, and subsequently we'll always check if that permission has been met, just in case. Over here you can see a usage, a type of usage with which you can use the camera from Expo camera, and you can try out the use effect with the permissions and so forth to set up a proper flow. If you don't have permissions, we'll show you an error case. And with that, we now have the ability to basically enable a camera in our emulator here, which we can then run on our actual phone, because the emulator will not be able to render out the camera screen. It will be able to do everything up until actually rendering the camera output, because it cannot do that. So with this example in place, what I want us to do is I want us to do a short exercise. I want us to go over to our camera screen. And what I want you to do is I want you to take the example here. And with all of the principles that we've put forward, try to implement a camera implementation. Now, what you can see over here is that with this camera implementation, they have everything from setting the front and back camera, and they have an example over here in a snack that you can try. And I just want you to use this information to try it out. Just try to implement this feature. And in the next video, we'll take a look at all of the different steps that we need to take in order to get the camera working and show the user their picture. Hopefully with that example, it all went pretty smoothly for you. But now let's take a look at how we can implement this. So the first thing we need to do is we need to import camera from Expo camera. And this is going to allow us to utilize the camera functionality. Now let's open up and let's do our return function, where inside of our return function, we're going to implement the camera. And this camera screen is what's going to show to the user. We're going to give it a particular style. We're going to give it width of 100%, height of 100%. So we can already see here that we're going to need a custom component. So let's go ahead and import styled from styled components /native. And what we'll do is we'll say const profile camera is equal to styled camera, and we'll put in our width of 100% and height of 100%. And by doing this now, we can actually use profile camera, no more inline styles over here. And let's close off profile camera. Now, another thing that we need to do is you could technically decide to have a pivot between the front and back camera. For this particular feature, I've decided solely to use the front camera since it's supposed to be a profile picture. A selfie seemed most appropriate. Now, the way that we do that is we give the camera a type. And so that type is type of camera.constants.type.front. And this is going to set the camera to always be the front camera. Now we're also going to give this a ref. So we're going to import useRef from React. And we'll say const camera ref is equal to useRef of nothing. Inside of here, we'll say ref is equal to, and we'll open the braces. We'll declare a function of R, and we'll say over here that camera ref dot current is equal to R, so that we can always know that we could also just call this camera to make it more declarative. And so now we know that camera ref is always going to reference the component over here. Okay, so having done this, what can we see in our app right now? Can we see anything? Well, let's go take a look. And if we open up our settings and we go to here, what we can see is that, oh, it's not rendering out on our simulator. Of course not. Our simulator does not have the ability to render out the camera module. So let's go ahead and do this on the phone. And so over here on the right hand side, you can now see my phone. And if we go over to our profile page and we tap the icon, the camera's still rendering black. Why is that? Well, we haven't requested any permissions of the user. So over here, if we go over to the permission section, we can see that they're using an effect to determine if the user has permission. So let's copy this line. Let's import use state. And what we'll do is we'll, above the useRef, has permission set permission, and we'll copy the effect. So we'll also import use effect. And by doing that, now we can put this over here. And oh, permissions are needed. We're getting our permission screen. So if we press allow, what's going to happen now? Well, let us quickly reload the app because it's probably in a faulty state. And then what we'll do is we'll go back to the settings. We'll go over here and oh, the camera's working because we've set our permission. Now, of course, this only works if our permission has been set. Now, so we also need to take into account if you do not have a permission, if the permission is false, we need to take those states into account. So down here, we're going to have this where we render an empty view. Now what we can do is we can import view from React Native. Import view from React Native. And we'll just render an empty view in the meanwhile. And for text, well, we know that we can import text from our components. So we'll import text from //components/typography/text. And so now if we do not grant permission, we also let the user know, hey, you do not have access to the camera. So we have a little bit of error handling in here. And so with that, we now have the full flow working for our application because we can render out the camera and we can't take a picture just yet. But what we can do is we can see ourselves. So now that we have that set up and we have the permissions set up and we have the first part of our solution, let's take a look at how we can take a picture, store the image. Our permissions are working and we're able to view the camera. But the next step we need to do is we need to enable the user to be able to take a picture. And the way that I implemented this is just a simple tap on the screen will take the picture. It's intuitive enough that the user is going to tap on the screen regardless, and by tapping on the screen, the picture will be taken and they'll be taken back automatically to the previous screen. The way that we do that is we can use our touchable opacity from React Native. So we do touchable opacity. And what we can do is we can put a touchable opacity inside of the profile camera. And by putting it inside of the profile camera, we now enable the user to tap on the screen. So if we put an onPress here, and we said that that onPress was going to invoke a function called snap, which is going to snap the picture, well, now we have to define that function. Const snap is going to be a function that's going to be asynchronous because every time you take a picture, it's going to happen asynchronously. You don't know what's happening because the camera module is out of our control. It's out of our domain. It's out of React Native. So when a picture is being taken, a lot of background processes are happening. So we do it in an async manner. Think of this like a promise. We know something's going to come back to us, so we're going to use async await, which is basically a wrapper around a promise that enables us to await something for it to come back. So what we'll do here is we set up our camera reference, which is going to point to the profile camera, and we can now use that camera reference. So we'll say if camera reference, then we can do stuff. If this has a value, then we know we can take a picture. So we'll say const photo, and this will get us back the photo, is await camera ref dot current, which is the current value of the camera ref, which will be the profile camera. So camera ref dot current dot take picture async. And this will go ahead and take a picture. And once it's taken a picture, what it's going to return us is console.log photo. And we'll know what the photo is at that point in time. Okay, so now if we have our touchable opacity here and we press snap, we'll know that we'll get it back, right? Well, let's try that out. If we just put our touchable opacity here and we open up our camera, which for that we'll open up the terminal as well so that we can see what's going on. And if we go over to here and we open up our camera, what's going to happen is when we press, oh, nothing's happening. Well, did we do something wrong? Well, let's quickly reload. If we reload and we try again, will it work? Let's try it out. Huh, pressing on the camera isn't doing anything. Well, why would that be? That's a good question. So if we go look at our code here, well, touchable opacity is inside of the profile camera. And if it's inside of the profile camera, is it actually taking up the width and height that it should? Obviously, our touchable opacity is in the wrong spot. So it shouldn't be inside of the profile camera, but rather it should be wrapping the profile camera. So if we put it over here and then we close the tag at the end, what will happen is our touchable opacity is now wrapping the entire camera. And if we open up our terminal here and we look at our camera, now if we press, oh, we're getting back information. We're getting back information from the camera ref. We're getting back a height. We're getting back a URI. So it's storing the image on the phone and we're getting back that image location on the phone. Well, this seems like something we can use to render out the profile picture of the user. Well, let's try it and go ahead and do that now that we have our camera hooked up to be able to take pictures. Awesome. In our last video, we left off being able to take a picture, and we know that the photo has particular properties that enable us to know where a photo is being stored. We have a photo.uri. Now, the question becomes, well, Mo, how are we going to store this photo, and where should we store this photo? And if we store the photo, will we actually be able to access it properly? Now, the way that I went about storing the photo is the same way that we stored the favorites. I stored them on the phone against a reference of the user. And by doing that, I now know every time that this user logs into this phone that they'll have the photo linked to their account by their unique identifier. And the way that I did that is, again, we need to use async storage. So let's go take a look at how we utilized async storage to begin with. In the services favorites, we had the favorites context. And in the favorites context, we imported something called async storage. So if we take that property and we import it inside of our camera component, we can now utilize that in order to store the photo information for the user. I hear you asking, Mo, shouldn't this be a service? We've followed the service pattern everywhere in this context pattern. Here's the separation that I see. Favorites was used practically globally. It could be used anywhere in the application. Authentication is used globally. Locations used globally. Restaurants is used globally. But the profile picture, the picture of the user, is only used on the settings screen inside of the settings feature. Therefore, I view it as a local consideration of the settings feature in order to store and retrieve its async storage information for this profile camera feature. What we'll do then is, when we take the photo, we now know that we can utilize async storage. And so what we'll do is say async storage.setItem, and we'll set the item based on the user ID dash photo, so the user ID photo, and we'll know now that photo.uri is part of that user ID photo. Okay, well, how do we get the user ID? Well, first we need to bring in the authentication context, because without the authentication context, we can't get the user's information. And then what we do is at the top over here, underneath camera ref, we'll say const user is use context of authentication context, which we need to pull in from React in order to utilize. So now we have the user's information and we can reference user.userid. And by doing this, we know that we'll have a user because you're only enabled to go to the settings screen when you're logged in. You won't be able to utilize the setting screen otherwise. So over here, we've basically implemented the saving of the photo. And by saving the photo now, what we've done is save that photo URI, that storage of that picture element. We need to retrieve it somewhere. And that's going to be inside of the settings screen. So we'll pull in async storage there as well at the top. And what we need to do in the settings screen is we need to pull in the actual implementation of async storage get item down here somewhere. Now, how are we going to go about that? Well, it's a good question. We could use a bunch of different things. What I want to use is use effect. And by using use effect, what we can do is anytime the user comes in to this screen, we'll do use effect and we'll render out their profile image. Now, should we do this only on render? Yeah, that sounds right. We'll do it every time this screen renders because we should only ever load it once. Well, maybe we should do it if the user changes because that would make more sense. Anytime the user changes, we should technically get the new profile picture, right? Yeah, that seems like a better idea. So what we'll do is we'll write a function called const get profile picture. And what we'll say here is that it's an async function, again, because it's going to work with async storage. And that async function is going to say const photo is equal to await of async storage dot get item. And the get item is going to retrieve this identifier right here. Let's make sure that we copy the correct portion. And if we just put that inside of the get item call, now we're ensured that we get the photo URI. So let's call that photo URI. And once we have the photo URI, we can use state. So we'll store the photo URI, use state, and we'll say const photo set photo is equal to use state of null. And then when we set the photo here to photo URI, we'll be ensured that once the photo is actually loaded, so we'll do get profile picture here. Once the photo is loaded, we'll know whether or not we should render an avatar icon or something else. So if we don't have a photo, render out the avatar icon, right? But if we do have a photo, well, what do we need to render out in that case? Well, there's something else that avatar exposes, and that is avatar.image. And instead of an icon, what we'll give it is a URI, so a source. And we'll say, just like an image, and we'll say URI is photo. The only difference here is that we'll do it when we do have a photo. And by doing this, we've now created the end-to-end feature for the photo. So let's test it out. If I go over here and I take a picture and then I go back, oh, it's not loading. Why is it not loading? Well, first of all, over here, we have a dependency. So we're putting in user, but we're not putting in get profile picture. So that's our first error. And then over here, this is using the user. So we have to invert this. We'll give user to get profile picture instead of just getting it like that. So we'll say current user, and we'll give it as a dependency, and we'll say over here current user.user ID. And then the other thing we should give it is the ability to re-render, because as you can see, now it re-rendered and it actually took in the photo. Now, that is interesting. It took in the photo, but when we take a photo over here and we go back, let's take a photo of something else because otherwise it's just going to look. Let's take a photo like this. What we can see over here is it's not changing. And that's because use effect only gets triggered if this remounts. So there's something else that we could use, is something called use focus effect. Use focus effect is an effect from React Native navigation rather than use effect, where anytime the screen gets back into focus through navigation, or the user changes, we're going to enable get profile picture to trigger. So if we go over to settings and we then take a picture here and we go back and we take a picture again and we go back, we can see that our picture is being triggered every time we get back into focus of the settings screen. So this is a React Native navigation feature that is kind of like use effect, but it only triggers. It triggers every time this screen is back into focus. So anytime we go back and forth between screens, we're going to trigger this, as well as when the user changes. So we have both situations covered. Okay. So we have our get profile picture, which is the async function that takes in the parameter of user, so that anytime the user changes, we're ensured that user is being given to the get item so that we get the item. We have use focus effect that ensures anytime a navigation event happens that we're going to trigger the get profile picture as well, because anytime we take a picture, it's going to update. But one thing we don't have here is when snap happens. When snap is happening, we're not navigating back. So let's take in navigation here, because this is a screen. And let's say once we set an item, let's do navigation.goBack. And by doing navigation.goBack, we'll enable the screen, once we take a picture, to go back, and thus enable the full-fledged feature of the camera taking experience. And that's exactly what we want. So anytime the user takes a picture, they'll go back, they'll take the picture. If we log them out here and we log into a different user, mo+2 at beanie.io, and let's say test123, and we log them in, what we can see over here is that in the settings, they don't have a picture. But if we load a picture like this, where we take a specific picture of that, now they're going to have this picture. If we go and we log in at mo@beanie.io, we do test123, and we log in, what we're going to see in the settings panel, the picture is loading. And if we go back to mo+2 at beanie.io, and we do test123, we're going to load that specific picture for mo+2. And that is exactly what we want. We want to load the specific picture for the specific user that's being logged in at that moment. Awesome. So we have the full end-to-end feature working now. And it only took this much code. Just a couple of lines, a good back and forth between the camera screen and the settings screen. And we now have the ability to store and retrieve the picture that the user takes anytime they go back and forth between the screens. Amazing.